Welcome back to another episode of Opalwave MTG, a channel dedicated to exploring power levels in EDH. This episode, we're going to be going over the Skirmish tier of Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. We're going to have a theme on taking the initiative and venturing into the dungeon. As usual, the deck list is in the description below, and if you want to help support my channel, be sure to give a like and subscribe so you can be notified when the battle and the glory tiers of this deck are going to be released. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, is a mono white 5 mana 4/7 with vigilance, and it has, if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time, and permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. So basically, it's a Hushwing type of effect for your opponents, and it's a Panharmonicon for all of your permanents. So there's two main abilities in the deck. The first one is going to be taking the initiative, which allows you to venture into the Undercity, which is a very specific dungeon. And then you've got the just regular venturing into the dungeon. And there are 3 different dungeons you can venture into, and then there's one Undercity. And whichever one you venture into first is going to determine which dungeon you continue to move through. So if you venture into the dungeon first, you'll choose one of the 3 dungeons, and you'll go through those. And if you take the initiative, you will start in the Undercity. Now, when you trigger either taking the initiative or venturing further into the dungeon, you will continue to go through whichever dungeon you chose first. So if you're already in the Undercity and you venture through the dungeon, you're going to continue going through the Undercity. And if you ventured into a dungeon first, and then you take the initiative, you're going to continue going through one of the original dungeons that you chose first. And the cool thing about this is, when we have these creatures with the ETB effect of taking the initiative or entering the dungeon, we're going to get 2 triggers of that. We're going to be able to venture through our dungeons super quick. There's a lot of different abilities you can do. You can either draw cards, you can put counters on things, you can make dudes, you can drain people, you can gain life. There's a lot of really cool stuff we can do here. So we've got a lot of our creatures that have this ETB stuff like Seasoned Dungeoneer, White Plume Adventurer, Radiant Solar is super sweet since it will trigger for all of your non-token creatures that are entering the battlefield. We've got a few utility cards, stuff like Lauren, that can, interact with our opponent's stuff. Some of the really cool interactions are cards with the Stonecloaker or the White Mane Lion, which have the ability to return a creature to your hand when it enters a battlefield. And because that ability is going to trigger twice, we can return both the White Mane Lion and one of our venture creatures back to our hand, and then we can keep getting those venture triggers over and over and over again. Super sweet interaction. We've also got a few other ways to blink with Livio or Sworn Sentinel, where we can basically exile a creature with an Aegis counter, and then we can activate Livio and bring all creatures back to the battlefield that have the Aegis counter on them. We've got a few ways to gain life with stuff like Soul's Attendant, Soul Warden. Suture Priest is also a super sweet one in this deck because of the way that Elesh Norn is worded. Creatures that enter our opponent's side of the field will still trigger our Suture Priest twice. So whenever that creature enters the battlefield, they'll lose 2 life instead of 1. Some really cool interactions going on there. Evangel of Heliod is going to make a ton of 1/1s that we can use to try to overrun our opponents, and Abdel Adrian can also do that as well. So he can enter the battlefield, you can exile all of your creatures with the venture mechanic, and then you'll make a bunch of 1/1s, but you can also just exile all those 1/1s that you just made with his second trigger and make even more 1/1s. So if you've got a Soul Warden or something like that out and you want more triggers, it's a great way to make a ton of life. Moving on to our sorceries, we've got a few board wipes here, stuff like Achroma's Vengeance, Austere Command, Collective Effort. We're gonna have a lot of creatures in this deck that we can tap to get some extra abilities, whether it's removing creature power 4 or greater, or destroying an enchantment, getting +1/+1 counters on our stuff, and a Dismantling Wave so we can interact a little bit more with our opponent's artifacts and enchantments, or just cycle it and destroy all of them. In the instance, we've added a few more ways to flicker our stuff like Acrobatic or Maneuver, Flicker of Fate. Ephemerate's a fun one. Eerie Interlude's going to be great for protecting our board since it brings those creatures back at the beginning of the next in-step. And then we've got a few targeted removal type spells. Generous Drift is great. Afterlife, in case a creature can regenerate. You don't see that a lot anymore. You can use Afterlife to destroy it. Valorous Stance can protect your stuff in addition to being removal potentially. And a Fateful Absence. Moving on to our artifacts, we've got a decent amount of ramp stuff like Arcane Signet, Commander Sphere. We're in that low tier kind of area, so 3-drop ramp, some 2-drop ramp. Nothing too crazy going on here. We've also got the Core Cartographer for a little bit of extra ramp since it has that ETB ability, and we can get 2 planes if we have Elesh Norn out. We've got a good bit of artifacts that can venture into the dungeon repeatably in case we don't have an ability to like get those ETBs going. And then some artifacts I really want to point out that have like super cool synergy here. Skyclave Relic, it has that ETB. If you kicked it, you get to create 2 tap tokens that are copies of the Skyclave Relic. And because that is an ETB effect, you're going to trigger that ability twice. So for 6 mana, you're going to end up making 5 mana worth of artifacts or mana. So that seems like a really cool interaction. Wanted to throw that one in here. Then we've got the Conjurer's Closet. So at our end step, we can flicker creatures and get more of those ventures. And then Panharmonicon as an additional way to trigger our ETBs even more with our Panharmonicon. Unfortunately, this only triggers artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield as opposed to all permanents with the Elesh Norn, but still a great way to double up on that kind of stuff. Moving on to our enchantments, we've got Authority of the Consuls, just like the Suitor Preached. As long as it's triggering an ability that we control, that ability triggers twice, so we'll be able to gain 2 life off of the Authority of the Consuls whenever something enters. Really sweet there. Blessed Sanctuary, a little bit of protection from stuff like Blasphemous Act, and then we can also make a bunch of unicorns with our ETBs. Far Travelers, another great way to exile our stuff at the beginning of the end step. The creature does need to be tapped in order to exile it, which shouldn't be too hard since you can just swing at someone and then you get that trigger. Martial Anthem can be a really cool reanimate spell. It has an ETB effect for every time you kicked it. So if you kick it once, you get to bring back 2 things to the battlefield. If you kick it 2 times, you get to bring 4 things back to the battlefield. With Elesh Norn, this makes this card pretty cost efficient, so figured we'd throw that in here. Spirit Bond can be sweet since we'll be making 2 of those spirits whenever a creature enters the battlefield. Great way to protect our stuff. Teleportation Circles, another way for us to flicker our creatures over and over again. And then we got a few more ways so we can enter in the dungeon: Thorough Investigation and Undercellar Sweep, as well as a Touch the Spirit Realm. It's got that channel ability, which can be really nice, and it also can just serve as permanent removal for 2 different non-land permanents or artifacts and creatures, sorry. And then the last enchantment I wanted to point out is this Meticulous Excavation. This card is from Brothers War, and I think it's super slept on. It has pay 3 mana, return target permanent you control to its owner's hand, and you can only activate it during your turn. And the cool thing about this is it's any permanent. And it's also just 1 mana to cast, so it can kind of just sit there. You cast it early, no one's going to really like think twice about it for a while, but then all of a sudden you're going to start bouncing your stuff and getting multiple like ETBs off of them. People are going to be like, wow, that card is pretty sweet, especially in this deck since we have a ton of ETBs. We can flicker or return any permanent, so enchantments or artifacts, creatures, even lands if we have some interactions that we want to double up on. Future Jacob here started doing the recording for the lands and realized that 2 of the lands in the deck don't really work as I thought they did, since they have a if you do sacrifice them clause, the lands from New Capenna, so I ended up taking them out. I just added 2 basics. Anyway, moving on to our lands, we got Dungeon Descent, so we can venture into the dungeon a little bit more. Sulfurian Void and Nubnalia can let us scry a little bit more. But the really cool lands here are going to be Endless Sand, which allows us to exile creatures, and then later we can bring those creatures all back to the battlefield. So a great way to protect our creatures. We can dodge a board wipe potentially, and then get a bunch of ETBs all at the same time. And then we've got Windbrisk Heights, which has that Hideaway, which is an ETB trigger. Elesh Norn is going to trigger that twice, so we'll Hideaway once, look at the top 4, put something in exile. Then you'll Hideaway again and put something else into exile. And then when you activate that last ability to play the exiled card without paying its mana cost, you can play both, or you can choose one of the cards that you exiled with the Hideaway ability. I did check with the judge just to make sure I was understanding that card correctly. And that's going to be the deck tech for the Skirmish version of Elesh Norn. Thanks for checking it out, and until next time.